Father Richard John Neuhaus, what is As I Lay Dying about?
As I Lay Dying, it's about, the occasion for it was that I almost died some years ago in connection with a series of catastrophic cancer surgeries. And for weeks and months afterwards, reflected on it and what it meant to be at death's door, what it meant to die, whether I had died or not, and what I means, what the word I means relative to the body's dying. So it's a book of reflections, a very personal book, a painfully personal book in many ways, a book of poetry in part, literary, philosophical, theological. But I think it's a book, I hope it's a book, that everybody who knows that we're all living toward dying, that is, that we live every day against the horizon of the fact that we're going to die, I hope people will be able to enter into what in many ways was the exhilarating and inspiring, albeit painful experience of being at death's door and being brought back.
What year was this?
1993, January 10th was when it all began.
Where?
New York City, where I live, and it is the kind of thing that ought not to have happened from a medical viewpoint. A number of lawyers have told me that I have a great malpractice suit if I ever wanted to go that route, but I didn't and I don't. I think that would in some way sully my gratitude for having been brought back and for the experience itself. But it was a case where I'd had a number of colonoscopies. Many of you viewers know what that is. And a search for cancer through the intestines and they didn't show anything, which of course from a medical viewpoint is quite astonishing. Many doctors have expressed almost disbelief that somebody could have been so incompetent as not to have caught what was a very major ulcer, which then on late Sunday afternoon, January 10th, 1993, a day that shall live in infamy, so to speak, all of a sudden I found myself just doubled up on the floor in excruciating pain.
Go back to just a moment for the colonoscopy. Was it a routine thing that you'd been taking the colonoscopy?
No, because there had been all kinds of abdominal problems and pains and just all kinds of things that shouldn't have been. And so I remember very well this doctor, not the one who did the colonoscopy, my regular physician, very nice person. And he was so proud of the fact that they now had this world-class fellow there who did the colonoscopies, and that therefore none of his patients would die of colon cancer. But that world-class fellow did it twice and then a third time and caught nothing, until finally I was in an emergency situation where this tumor was simply exploding. We don't want to get into the grisly guts here, but and it was just a terrible, terrible experience. And then they had to go in, and it was a long, long operation, of course. And fortunately, I was living in New York. I was near the hospital, the emergency room of the hospital. And as I say in the book, it's always good when you go in there to have a couple of friends with you, especially friends who can intimidate, if necessary, even physically, because there was this very, very officious woman in charge of the desk, and who was not about to let me jump the line. You know, there were a lot of other people there. And,
what hospital was it?
Cabrini Hospital on 19th Street, a block from where I live in New York. But finally, after I fainted and passed out on the floor, she finally decided that maybe there was something seriously wrong.
You were, in 1993, how old?
57.
And had you, other than this discomfort, had you been in pretty good health?
Yes. In fact, remarkably good health all my life. Never really seriously ill at all.
What was your job then?
Well, I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of New York, and so I have a parish, Immaculate Conception on 14th Street and 1st Avenue in New York, Manhattan. And then I run a think tank, a research and education institute called the Institute on Religion and Public Life. And our main project, the main project is the monthly magazine, First Things, a journal on religion and public life. So my work was as a parish priest, as a director of an institute, editor, writer, lecturer, and so forth. I had only 2 years before then been ordained a Catholic priest. I had been a Lutheran pastor for 30 years, from 1960, and had spent many years in Brooklyn in the black, very low income Williamsburg, Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn.
Why'd you make the switch from Lutheran to Catholic?
Well, to be more fully who I was and what I was as a Lutheran. I recently wrote an essay, and the title was How I Became the Catholic That I Was. And that's really, in very compact form, the message. That is, I believe, that the fullness of the Christian reality through time is most fully and rightly embodied in the Catholic Church, and that the whole Christian reality that is outside the boundaries of the Catholic Church gravitates toward unity with the Catholic Church. I'm putting this all together too simply and too succinctly to do justice to the complexity of it, but for many, many years, as a Lutheran pastor and writer and theologian, I had worked for what I called the healing of the breach of the 16th century between Rome and the Reformation. And I think for a very, very long time, it was believable to me and to many others. I was by no means in a small minority. To many others, it was believable that this reconciliation, this ecclesial reconciliation between the Reformation tradition and Rome would happen. After many, many years of this effort, by the mid-'80s, I could no longer persuade myself or others that, in fact, this was a realistic project. It may still happen, God willing, sometime in the distant future, in which case I'll be the first to give thanks.
What year did you make the move?
I entered into full communion with the Catholic Church in September 8th, the Nativity of Our Lady, in 1990. And then I was ordained by Cardinal O'Connor. I was received by Cardinal O'Connor, my dear friend, to whom the book is dedicated. And then ordained to the priesthood in September 8th of 1991.
And when you decide you want to become a Catholic priest, and you've been would you have been a Lutheran priest or a Lutheran minister?
Well, Lutherans usually use the word pastor.
Pastor.
Yeah.
What did you have to do did you have to go to more school or just?
Well, not really. The Cardinal John O'Connor set up a kind of special colloquium process. But I had been reading, teaching, and indeed writing about Catholic theology and Catholic doctrine and so forth for years and years. So he thought at least that I was theologically informed and spiritually formed to be a priest. I hope he was right about
Where
that.
are you from originally?
I was born in the Ottawa Valley of Canada, a little, a not so little town for that area called Pembroke, Ontario, right on the Ottawa River, which divides Quebec and Ontario. And that my dad was a Lutheran pastor there, and we had children in the family. And it was kind of an odd thing. Today it sounds almost like child abuse, but at the time in our family, at least with the 6 boys, it is assumed that when you were 14 or 15 years old, you were pretty much ready to go out on your own. And my parents were both U.S. citizens who had emigrated to Canada. And nobody ever said it in so many words, and I'm sure Canadian viewers will not be glad to hear this, but they'll understand, is that it was just taken for granted when we were children in our family that Canada was for childhood, and then when you grew up, you went to the States. And I knocked about. I went to Nebraska to a church-related Lutheran school where my sister and brother-in-law were. And I got kicked out of there, actually. They didn't tell me that you weren't supposed to have panty raids on the girls' dormitory or beer parties in the dormitory and so forth. So, in fact, I'm a high school dropout. Never did finish high school. I went down to Texas then because I had some shirt-tail cousins down in a place called Cisco, Texas, which is West Texas. Cisco Kid comes from there. Also, Conrad Hilton has his first hotel was in Cisco, Texas, the Maribel Hotel. It's still there. And I was just kind of knocking about. I was the youngest member at age 15, the youngest member of the Texas Chamber of Commerce. I raised a little bit of money and bought a service station and a grocery store outside of Cisco, Texas. But then after a period of time, I realized what I had earlier discerned, and that is that I was supposed to be a pastor. And so I went to the church-related school in what's now called the Concordia University in Austin, Texas, and it was Concordia College and Academy. It had a high school and a college. And when I got there, the day I arrived, there was registration, and you stand in one line and you could register for high school, and you could stand in another line and register for college. And I looked at this situation and I said, well, given your druthers, it's better to register for college, better to be in college than high school. So I stood in the college line. When I got to the front of the line, the registrar said, we have not received your high school transcript. And I, being a person who cannot tell a lie, but also being a person filled with hope, the virtue of hope, I said, I hope you will receive one soon. And thereby registered for college. And it was only after I'd finished college and done reasonably well and so forth that the registrar once again called me in and said, whatever did happen to that high school transcript? And I fessed up.
What happened then to your life?
Then I went to Concordia Seminary, St. Louis, Lutheran Seminary, 4-year program. At that time, a very, very rigorous, academically rigorous program. Mandatory Greek, Latin, German, Hebrew. I'm very grateful for the theological training I received at that time at Concordia, St. Louis. And interned in Chicago and then in Detroit, and fell in love with the city and with the idea of city ministry. And that was the time, of course, in the late 50s, beginning of the 60s, where so much was deliriously filled with a sense of possibilities and belief. As you remember, Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, which I was early caught up in. John the 23rd, the good Pope, the genial John the 23rd, John F. Kennedy, be perhaps the first Catholic and vibrant and young and energetic. So, and I was absolutely caught up in what was then called the movement.
But you're a Lutheran, though.
I was a Lutheran. Oh yeah. But what I wanted, and the pertinence of this, is that it was assumed that I was going to go on that is the faculty and most of my friends assumed I was going to go on in an academic career. But I wanted none of that at all. I wanted inner city, preferably black, very poor, the more desperate the better. I make no apology for that. I was a starry-eyed kid full of enthusiasm. And we went to the personnel director. You didn't get a choice, really, at St. Louis as to where you would be assigned. You could be assigned literally anywhere in the world, but I told you could state a preference, so I gave that preference for inner city work, etc. And the director of personnel had a little map of the world that about maybe 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch, and he says, well, as you can see, Richard, it's not really in New York City, because I'd said in the best of all possible worlds, I'd want to be in the inner city of New York. He said, it's not really in New York City, but it's very close. Well, it was up on the St. Lawrence River, about 400 miles away. And it was a grand time in Messina, New York. I was there for a little less than a year. And then it happened that in Brooklyn, in the Williamsburg, Bedford-Stuyvesant section of Brooklyn, this parish had gone vacant. That is, it had no pastor. It was an old, big 19th century German Lutheran congregation. The neighborhood had dramatically changed, primarily African American and Hispanic, the typical white flight out to the suburbs. So here was this shell of an old church, which the Lutheran Church wanted to close this church because they saw no future for it at all. But I got wind of this through some connections, and I received a call to St. John the Evangelist. We called it St. John the Mundane to distinguish it from St. John the Divine, the Episcopal Cathedral up in Morningside Heights.
What year was this?
That was 61, April of 61.
When can you remember the first time you saw somebody die?
The first time I saw somebody die, yes, I don't mention this incident in the book, but it was an old woman across the street in the housing projects, and she had called and she was very, very afraid, and I went in to see her. She couldn't open the door. I had to go get the super to get the key to the door, and she was lying in bed, and she was terrified. And it was, I talk in the book about different experiences with people dying. This was a very, not only apparently terrifying for her, but terrifying for me moment. In many, many other occasions, see, one of the things that there was no salary at this church and there was no anything else. And so one of the things I had to do to make a living, so to speak, to keep things going, I became a chaplain at Kings County Hospital, which at that time boasted of being the largest medical center in the world. I don't know if that's true, but it had something like 3,000 beds.
Where is it?
It's in Brooklyn, the very heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant. And so that's where I encountered again and again people dying, because they had, it sounds brutal today, and maybe it was, but there was just a section that we just called the death ward. And where, you know, people for whom there was no other medical treatment in prospect, aside from sedation, would simply be put into this large ward, men and women. I discuss this in the book, and in the hot New York, Brooklyn days, no air conditioning. And you just have anywhere from 50 to 100 people writhing and naked, tossing off their bedclothes, very much like Dante's Inferno, as one might imagine it. And that's where I routinely, although it never becomes routine, but regularly, was with people as they died.
What do people do? Is there any way to categorize it?
No, it's various. And, you know, it's true, and I'd want to say it's true, that the best preparation for a good death is a good life. And yet, I think there's no clear or demonstrable correlation, at least in my experience. Some people who apparently just had wretched lives, that is both in terms of their misfortune and in terms of their behavior, die with great tranquility. There's I mention in the book, an old man, Albert, about 70 years old, black, poor, bald. I don't know why, his big, shiny, bald head. And I'd been up in the morning to see him, and we knew he didn't have much longer, and we'd talked together and prayed together. And then I went up that evening, and he was obviously close to the end, and I were kind of holding him by the shoulders like this, and we prayed together the Our Father. And then he looked at me, and he said, "Oh," he said, "don't be afraid." And then he died. And this is an astonishing thing, that I realized that here I was, presumably in the role of ministering to him, but that in his very last moment of consciousness, he was concerned for me. He was ministering to me. So it is with many, many other experiences, some of which I recount in the book.
Charlie, the 43-year-old deacon?
Charlie Williams. Oh, what a beautiful guy. And full of energy and hopefulness, ebullient, really. And then I still don't know what exactly the medical problem was, but something had happened with his lungs. And I remember being with Charlie at the very end, and we'd been very close. He'd been a great help in so many ways. And he just kind of looked at me, and with a remarkable innocence, not with any tone or edge of complaint, simply said, "Why? Why?" And then he died. Today, of course, with what are viewed as medical advances, and which are in some respects advances, the moment of being with people, being present to people, and their being present to you in their dying moment is ever more rare, because people are sedated in so many different ways and hooked up to, as I was, to endless machines. And so that for most people, the last encounter, whether it's with a member of the family or a friend, is hours or even days, and sometimes weeks, before the person actually dies. And the moment of death is more a matter of technical registration on the medical machinery than it is of personal encounter.
Do you have any idea how many people you've seen die?
Well over 100, certainly. Yeah, I tried to count it up one day, and it's quite possibly 200 or more, but certainly well over 100. Yeah.
We'll go back to then 1993 on that January day when you got the stomach pains.
Right.
Where were you?
At the house. We have a residence of a community on 19th between 1st and 2nd Avenue in Manhattan. And as I say, they hustled me. A friend of mine, George Weigel, a writer who I think you perhaps know, and they hustled me down to Cabrini Hospital. And then crazy things. I mean, you're, of course, immediately then after we got past the officious gatekeeper, you're shot up with a lot of stuff before you're taken to the operating room.
Did you have any idea what was wrong with you at that time?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I knew there was something terribly wrong in my stomach, that something was busting. And no, you get Joy, my friend who was with me at the community house, called my doctor when I was found, just rolled up in fetal position on the floor, just in absolutely seized with this unspeakable pain. And so he calls the doctor. The doctor's on vacation, but of course leaves another number for another doctor. And this other doctor, having listened to my friend's description of what was happening, said, "Oh, well, it's probably constipation. You should get a very strong laxative," and gave him a laxative. Well, I mean, you knew that wasn't the case. Excuse me. Doctors since then have told me that quite possibly would have killed me right then and there. And I don't talk about it much in the book. My experience of medicine and of the state of medicine, and whether it's a science or whether it's an art or whether it's a roulette game, and this is related to also, I'm sure why I wasn't at all interested and am not at all interested in making a fuss about malpractice or whatever, is that you realize you're entering into a circumstance that is wildly out of control, and that you have no illusions that you or anybody else is going to effectively bring it under control. And the disposition, at least as I experienced it, was one of unprecedented surrender. I don't mean just resignation or in the negative sense of passivity or indifference, but of recognizing something almost very, very good, and that is not being in control. And at least for me, psychologically, and I expect spiritually, this was a salutary and a healthy thing, because I think most people have always seen me as someone perhaps a little excessively concerned about being in control.
So you found yourself to the hospital, into the emergency room?
In the emergency room, last, of course, I remember is looking up at the elevators didn't work. I remember that. Odd kind of things. In fact, as I was going up, trying to get up to the emergency room, and they'd shot me up, of course, with a bunch of stuff, I was no longer in great pain. I was feeling almost kind of giddy. You know, this was sort of like, here we are, like in a television hospital show, you know, with everybody going around with doing their properly energetic and urgent technical things. And then we get to the elevator bank. If I recall, the operating room was on the 6th floor, and none of the elevators worked. And so there we are, the whole medical team and me on a gurney, of course, lying back, and nobody could get an elevator to work. But finally a security guard came along and got one working. Yeah, and then you look up at the ceiling, at the water-stained ceiling, I remember that. And as I say, then I prayed, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. A prayer that goes back to the 12th century that I've prayed all my life long. And you simply commend yourself into the very distinct possibility that maybe this is it. And so then the next I was conscious, of course, was the next morning, maybe about 6 hours later. And what had happened on the operating table is that once they'd done the big operation, taken out this huge tumor, cut out about 7-8 feet of your intestines and sewed it back up, put this colostomy in on the side, then sew you all up. Then they discovered I was losing all vital signs. And clearly there was a hemorrhage inside. Something had gone wrong. And so, I mean, afterwards, this conversation...
But you weren't conscious?
No, at that time I wasn't conscious, no. But as this was recounted to me afterwards, there was this debate, you know, well, what do we do now? And obviously, if they didn't go back in, I was certainly dying. All my vital signs were fading. And of course, if they did go back in, that might kill me as well. But they did go back in and discovered that the hemorrhage was from the spleen, which had been, as the doctor said, nicked accidentally in the process. I don't blame him for this at all. I mean, it must have been an unspeakable mess. You know, opening someone up without any preparation. You see, this was under emergency circumstances. Ordinarily, for this kind of operation, you're cleaned out, you know, well in advance, and there are all kinds of preparatory measures. But this was, you know, just in the rush of the moment. So you got guts and blood and fecal material. And I mean, that he only nicked the spleen, I think is, you know, we're probably fortunate. But then they had to go and fix that and then sew me all up again. And then the next, I remember, and I recount this in the book because this was very important, is that I wasn't coming out from the anesthetic. And later on, I would discover that there was a real question about the competence of the anesthesiologist at these operations. This was told me by some of the medical personnel. But clearly something was wrong. I was not coming out in any way. But I was perfectly conscious, perfectly alert, lucidly alert.
Were your eyes open?
No, eyes were closed. But I could hear everything going on around me. I could hear them all discussing, you know, well, what's the problem, and so forth. And it was a most astonishing thing that you were lying there, and there was a complete disconnect between your mind and your body. Your mind racing, fully functioning, but no relationship to the body whatsoever. The body was, the experience was, as though you were encased in a marble slab. And of course they were saying, you know, well, wiggle your toes, you know, or move your right thumb. And I could hear them saying all these things and discussing why I didn't and couldn't, which reminded me of something that I'd often told people when they're around people who are very sick or are unconscious and so forth. Be very careful of what you're saying, because there's a lot more, quite possibly a lot more going on there in terms of alertness and awareness of what's happening with that sick person than you think, and be careful what you say in this context. Well, in any case, so this went on and on. Oh, it seemed like many hours.
Did you ever try to struggle to get out?
Oh, yeah. I tried to struggle to even make a connection between the bodies, just as though the body belonged to somebody else. It's just as though it were a corpse there.
Did you feel trapped?
Oh, emphatically so, yes.
Couldn't speak?
Oh, no. Couldn't blink an eyelash. Couldn't... Well, it was at this point, this was going on, and then someone says, well, the Cardinal is coming. Here comes the Cardinal.
Cardinal O'Connor.
Cardinal O'Connor. And so it's right up to my right ear. I'm lying there. Now, you have to understand, just looking totally dead, I'm sure.
Were there a lot of people in the room?
Oh, there must have been 4 or 5, yeah. This was quite a bit of agitation going on. And Cardinal O'Connor, right into my right ear, he says, "Richard, wiggle your nose." And I thought to myself, now, can you imagine thinking this at that time? Why does he say wiggle my nose? Everybody else says wiggle your toe, move your right thumb, whatever. He says wiggle your nose. And then I thought, well, he was a chaplain in Vietnam. He must have been with a lot of people when they were dying. And somewhere he picked this thing up, wiggle your nose. And so I'm lying there, and I have never, this is a true saying, I have never in my life worked so hard to do anything as to just, and it maybe moved, I suppose, 1/64th of a centimeter or whatever. And Cardinal O'Connor says, he did it. And the doctor says, no, he didn't. I didn't see it. And he says, into my ear again, wiggle your nose again, Richard. Oh, I try to make that connection between the brain and this body that seemed to belong to somebody else. And I did it again, and the doctor saw it. And it was like a celebration, as though somebody had risen from the dead. But it was, much of the book, as you know, deals with this question of the relationship between the mind and the body and the consciousness and brain, and where in all of this is the I, or the soul, the self. And in many, many different permutations, that set of questions kept coming back to me, as it was in this case, emphatically and powerfully brought home.
When did you move things? I mean, really move things? Your arms, your eyes open?
I think probably that same day. Of course, you're in the intensive care unit. You're taken to the intensive care unit. And that's a strange place. Of course, I'd been in intensive care units many times to visit and minister to other patients.
Had you ever been in a hospital before?
I'd been in the hospital for minor, but for nothing serious, and certainly never in the intensive care unit. And it's again, I come back to this theme of surrender, which is a mix of resignation, but also an active decision. And you're lying there, and of course you're kind of in and out of consciousness. And there was no clock there, and there were no windows. So whether it was night or whether it was day, you were hooked up, of course, to, at one time I remember counting something like 16 different tubes and pumps and machines and stuff all over you. And you're, there was a woman who came by, it seemed to me every 20 minutes, but that couldn't possibly have been the case. And she wore a big brown wool hat, and she had gold chains, as I remember. And she'd come by and she'd say, "I want blood." And he'd tell you, because they're always testing your blood. And I realized that in that circumstance, that if someone had come along and said, well, now we're going to take off your right leg, Father, I probably said, oh, well, I guess, yeah, okay, take off the right leg. I mean, you just have this extraordinary sense of being at the disposal of a circumstance and of others in charge of that circumstance, in which you really have no say. And there's something, again, good about that. That is, as I look back upon those weeks and those months, I think among the things I learned was that at the very bottom, when you entirely let go, when you are shorn of any illusions of control or decision-making or whatever, that there's a force, a power still holding you. And you need not be afraid. That in the heart of the darkness is, from a Christian understanding, hope, because in the heart of the darkness is the total state of dereliction of Christ on the cross. It's a very, that I never knew with quite that penetrating and I hope life-transforming force.
When did you begin to process the possibility of death? I mean, you'd been rushed to the emergency room and you were in the operating room before you knew it, and then there you are trapped in that body. When did you start thinking about the possibility that you wouldn't get out of this?
Well, when I was, as I said, with this sensation under the anesthetic where I wasn't responding to anything and had this, as it seemed to me, body locked into this marble slab. It was kind of like a marble slab like you might have in a cemetery, and I thought of death then. In the intensive care unit, the one great thought that kept coming back is, I almost died. I almost died. And I mean, this took me, you have to understand, in the full tide of life and of energy and of engagement with projects and so forth. And it was like, well, the metaphor the doctor used, of course, is you're being hit with a Mack truck going at about 60 miles an hour, and then being hit again because they had to open the whole body up in order to find out where this hemorrhaging was and so forth. So, but this fact that I'd almost died, and maybe I'm going to die very soon, I thought, I think, especially in that first week or so, that I didn't have very long. But in an odd kind of way, the question of death and of dying, of my dying, of the fact that everybody's dying, which sounds, of course, terribly morbid and almost sick in its obsessiveness. But the fact is, and I'm sure many people have had this experience, that when you go through something like this, death becomes almost your every moment's thought. I recall, as I say in the book, I think it was 2 years later, it was almost 2 years later, that one day, as I was walking to the office over to First Things on Fifth Avenue, I realized there's something odd about this day. And it occurred to me that it was the first day that my main thought, that my chief thought, was not the thought of death, of my dying, of a world that's dying. I used to, for months afterwards, I'd walk by the playground in 19th and 2nd Avenue and see all the kids playing there. And I'd see little kids dying. That is, I would, in my mind's eye, see their skin putrefying and they're growing old and dying. Or see some young model walking up Park Avenue full of life and a sense of unlimited possibilities. And you'd almost feel like crying out, don't you know you're dying? Don't you know we're all dying? It's very hard to explain, but I think people who've been there will know what I mean.
So that took 2 years.
Yeah.
To get past that. What about putting words on paper? I know this started out as an article somewhere.
Yeah, in First Things, I wrote an article called Born Toward Dying.
What year?
I must have written that in 96, I guess.
So that's 3 years after.
Yeah, about 3 years after it happened. And I got a remarkable response to the article. Different, not necessarily more intense, but different from almost anything I'd written, from all kinds of people who'd had similar experiences, you know. And so a lot of people said, well, you know, you really ought to put this into a book. And it's still a small book. It's really about maybe 4 times the size of the article.
About 168 pages. Basic books put it out. By the way, just because this is something that people who have been through this would want to know, the colostomy was reversed.
Yes. Yeah.
How long after the operation?
Fairly shortly, about maybe 3 months or so, against the doctor's advice. He wanted to put it off, but it was. I hated the idea of having a colostomy. I mean, you know, it's an embarrassment, and this plastic thing on your stomach which receives all your excretion, etc., and you have to take it off. And I just despised the notion. I found it terribly humiliating. And so I was very adamant about, we have to reverse this as quickly as possible. And the truth is that after we'd scheduled the operation for the reversal and everything in the weeks immediately before it, I'd rather gotten used to it. And I didn't feel the great urgency anymore, except that we'd already scheduled it.
How long did it take you to get back to where you are today, physically?
I don't know. The perhaps somewhat arbitrary medical judgment is that after 5 years, if there's been no reoccurrence, you're presumably in complete remission, and they put you back in your proper little slot on the actuarial tables and so forth. So 5 years is the medical bright line, so to speak.
How do you feel
now? Oh, terrific. Yeah, no, I feel as well as I've ever felt in my life. Yeah.
We're out of time. Here's the cover of the book. It's a small book, 168 pages. As I Lay Dying, Meditations Upon Returning by Father Richard John Neuhaus of New York City. Thank you very much.
A joy to be with you.